Alright, so this lecture will be a brief one. Shouldn't be too long. The main topic of the lecture is that we're going to cover what is a media effect. What do we mean when we say the media has an effect? Overall, there are three different areas that we can think of as effects. And these are basically different areas where the media might affect us. There are cognitive effects, attitudinal or emotional effects, and then also behavioral effects. I'll go through each one of these effects areas and talk about them in a little bit, and then at the end there'll be a short kind of quiz, not really graded or anything like that, but just to get you guys thinking about which types of effects they are, and I'll go over the answers and talk about why each effect is what. This will be important for the exam, so you should think about these. Also, this is going to be important for throughout the course when we talk about different areas of media effects. So this is an important lecture. I would suggest coming back to it later on. And you'll definitely want to come back to this after we talk about the history of the study of mass communication, which will be the next lecture, because that lecture will cause us to think about, well, does the media have large effects or small effects? Does it only affect us sometimes? And this lecture will be important for that as well. Alright, so cognitive effects are effects where the media influences us in the way we think. When we talk about cognition, we're talking about mental processes. So this is how we think, it's also what we know. So there's many different types of cognitive effects. If you change what you know, we can think of that as being learning. Now learning is an important media effect. That's where you add new knowledge. But we can also think about cognitive effects being changing how we think. So we can have increases or decreases in attention due to media. We can have increases or decreases in short-term memory due to media. And also media can create mental models. I'll just go through each one of these and briefly talk about what I mean. So if we think about increases and decreases in attention, there's some researchers who argue that exposure to media can actually cause people to become less attentive. There's a researcher named Nicholas Carr. He wrote a book called The Shallows, and in that book he argues basically that exposure to the internet causes people to lose their attention span or decrease their attention span. So if you think about the internet, there's lots of information coming at you. You can quickly change what you're thinking about. You can search for things very fast. So there's lots of changes there, and it doesn't really cause you to focus on any one particular thing for an extended period of time. Now, Nicholas Carr says that because we're not learning to focus on something for any extended period of time, and we're actually being encouraged to focus on many different things throughout our exposure processes on the internet, that basically we are losing our ability to focus for an extended period of time. So if you think about YouTube videos, they're generally very short, only a couple of minutes. And in fact, I've had friends say, I can't watch that video, it's too long, and it's only been like a 3-minute video. Now 3 minutes doesn't seem like a long amount of time to spend with something, but it's becoming an increasingly long amount of time due to the fact that the internet is so fast. There's a pretty funny site called 5-Second Films. If you've never seen it, I would suggest checking it out. Some of the content's a little iffy, but it's pretty funny. But it kind of illustrates this point where our exposure processes and what we're exposing ourselves to is becoming very, very short and very, very compact. In fact, they are making 5-second films now. So we can have increases and decreases in attention. People have argued that we can have increases or decreases in our short-term memory. So going along those same lines, if we're only exposing ourselves to information for short periods of time, maybe we're losing our ability to remember that information for longer periods of time. Those are just some ideas of mental processes, though. I've got one more example where I want to talk about how the internet can help us create mental models. Now, a mental model is a thought process for understanding the world. It's our way of figuring out how things work, how we assume things work. And so just as a quick example, I want you to imagine yourself high up in Spartan Stadium and you're looking down at the field. Now look around and see all the seats, and picture it in your mind. Now look at the S in the center of the field. And I just want to ask, did you zoom in on the S? If so, that's maybe a mental model that was created through media. Now if we think about a zoom, everyone's probably familiar with this. In film, when you zoom in on something, the object that appears far away all of a sudden moves towards the camera, or it appears to move towards the camera. Now a zoom in requires two lenses. It requires one lens to move towards the other lens for the zoom to work. Now if we think about our eyes, we only have one lens on our eyes, so we can't actually zoom with our eyes. We can focus on things in the foreground and we can focus on things in the background, but that's just adjusting the focus. It's not actually moving the image. So it's safe to say that none of us have ever zoomed in our entire life just using our eyes. We've never been able to do that. No one in the history of the world has been able to do that because we only have one lens in our eye. So the question becomes, how did we learn to zoom? How did we picture that? Well, some people would argue that just this type of mental model, this zoom-in mental model, was created through exposure to media. That before we had media, and before we had cameras, and before we had multiple lenses, it was impossible to picture a zoom. But once we create those technologies, we can start learning that information. And we create mental models to help us, and we can incorporate those mental models into our everyday routines. So the zoom in maybe is an example of a mental model and a cognitive effect caused by media. This is just an example I wanted to give you for mental models, so it's not really clear whether this is true or not, but it's a nice example, I think, that illustrates how media exposure might create those mental models. There's probably lots of ones we can think about in terms of the internet. Alright, so cognitive effects are one form of effect. There's also emotional or attitudinal effects. So when we think about emotions and attitudes, we think about them in being in slight contrast to cognition. So emotions and attitudes tend to be feelings that we have. Sometimes, but not always, they're supported by cognition. So sometimes our emotions and our cognitions are in accordance with each other. We're feeling the same things that we're thinking. But other times our emotions are guiding us in one direction and our cognition is guiding us in the other. If you think about conflicts between the heart and the head, for example, right? You know you want to do something, or you know you need to do something, but your body's telling you no, that's not what you want to do. Emotion and attitudes are also called affect occasionally, and that basically just means the valence of the emotion, right? If we think about affect, you can have positive affect, I like something. You can have negative affect, I dislike something. So when we talk about emotions, attitudes, or affect, we're kind of all talking about the same type of effects. There's different types of emotional and attitudinal effects. Persuasion would be one type of attitudinal effect. And then also we have mood-altering media that can be another form of attitudinal effect. Now when we think about persuasion, we're thinking about changing or maintaining an attitude. So changing or maintaining your feelings towards something. This could be an individual. For example, with politics, we often think about persuasion and political communication, so trying to change people's opinion about a politician or maintain their loyalty to a politician. We also think about persuasion in terms of advertising, in terms of products, so trying to get people to have a favorable attitude towards a product or a negative attitude towards a product. So that's persuasion, and that deals with maintaining our attitudes or changing our attitudes to be in accordance with the message. Other forms of attitudinal or emotional effects include mood-altering media. So if you think about entertainment, in many ways entertainment is not a cognitive effect. We're not trying to learn anything through entertainment, but we're trying to manage our mood. So if you're feeling sad, you might expose yourself to a comedy film to make yourself feel better. If you're feeling run down, you might listen to a song that you know will particularly make you feel better or give you some energy, right? You might listen to a song to make you want to go to bed at night. All of these types of exposures are somewhat conscious, but they're designed to alter our moods. They're designed to alter our emotions. So if I'm upset, I might expose myself to media to make myself feel better. Our last form of effect area is behavioral effects. Behavioral effects are basically how we act, how we behave. Now, behavioral effects can be termed into two different types of behaviors: conscious behaviors, that is what we have control over, or unconscious behaviors, what we don't have control over. So some behavioral effects we become aware that the media has changed our behavior. Other behavioral effects we're not aware of. So two quick examples here are mimicry and then physiological effects. Mimicry is the really powerful media effect that kind of guided some of the early research that we'll talk about next lecture. But this is basically monkey see, monkey do type of effects. So you see someone in the media do something and then you go try it. This is a type of effect that people tend to be worried about with children. The children exposed to violent media or fantastical media will alter their behavior and try to imitate what they're seeing. So a child watches Superman fly, he ties a towel around his neck and then jumps off a building, right? People are worried about these types of effects. We don't really see straight mimicry as much with adults, but we do see it through adolescent years, right? So lots of people dress in a specific way, imitating media figures when they're adolescents. If you think about goth movements, emo, all of these different things, a lot of times they're derived from the media. Physiological effects deal with bodily processes. So the media can actually change how our body works. And this is a type of behavioral effect, and it would be an unconscious effect because we're not always aware of how our physiology or what our physiology is doing. So just some examples of behavioral effects. If we watch an action-packed movie, it can increase our heart rate. That is an example of a physiological effect. Anything dealing with our bodily processes such as heart rate, arousal regulation, skin conductance, blood pressure, all of these things are physiological effects. And exposure to media can actually change them. Watching scary movies can decrease our fear reactions over time. There's a lot of research looking at children and their exposure to scary films. Children expose themselves to scary films even though they know they will frighten them. A lot of people argue that this is due to the fact that children need to learn arousal regulation and emotional regulation, and that media can help us do that because media is a relatively safe environment to mess with our emotions. We can kind of play with our emotional responses. So watching scary movies can decrease fear reactions for children. That would be a physiological effect as well. Also, watching a story about old people can make us move slower. This is an interesting finding done on research examining mental models and how they influence our actual behavior. So if you expose yourself to a story about old people, you actually might move slower leaving a theater than if you exposed yourself to a movie about young people. The idea is that that exposure kind of primes those ideas of being old, being slow, not being able to move quickly. So kind of interesting research. We'll talk about that later in the semester as well when we talk about priming. But these are all different behavioral effects, physiological and behavioral. So here are 4 examples that I just want to go over, and you should try to write down or think about which one is which. So is it a behavioral effect, is it a cognitive effect, or is it an attitudinal or emotional effect? So Jim watches a TV show about snakes and learns that some snakes can detect body heat through infrared senses. Is that emotional, cognitive, or behavioral, that effect, learning that information? Little Timmy body slams his brother after watching wrestling. Is that a behavioral effect? Is that a cognitive effect? Or is that an emotional effect? John feels adrenaline start pumping through his body while he is watching the Avengers. Again, is that emotional, cognitive, or behavioral? Sam listens to a political news story and becomes angry when he hears about unjust laws being proposed. Again, is that cognitive, is that emotional, or is that behavioral? So Jim watches a TV show about snakes and learns that some can detect body heat through infrared senses. This is a cognitive effect. The effect here is that Jim watched the TV show and he learned information. Learning that new information is the cognitive effect. He's adding information to his current knowledge. Little Timmy body slams his brother after watching wrestling. This is a behavioral effect. This is a type of mimicry effect that people tend to be concerned about. Timmy reproducing the behavior that he saw on TV is an effect of the behavioral class. He's changing his behavior based on what he saw. John feels adrenaline start pumping through his body while he is watching The Avengers. Now this is also a behavioral effect. It's a slightly different type of behavioral effect because while I say in the question that he starts feeling the adrenaline pumping, you're not always aware of that. So it could be an unconscious effect. This is a media change created in John's physiology. So his physiology actually changes based on what he's exposed to. In the last one, Sam listens to a political news story and becomes angry when he hears about unjust laws being proposed. This is an attitudinal effect. Anger was increased in John, which is an emotion. And also this type of effect could change or maintain Sam's attitudes towards the people proposing the law. Sam could stay positive or stay negative. He could move from positive to negative based on the information and the emotions that he felt. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the lecture. Like I said, it was just kind of a quick one. But these are the different types of effects we can think about: cognitive, attitudinal, and behavioral. So when you're thinking about and you're listening to future lectures, go back and think about these different types of effects and try to classify the effects we're talking about into one of these three categories.